Ever since the first English aristocrats hated William Shakespeare for having the audacity to write the best plays in the English language despite being poor, the literary world has had authorship debates. After a bit over a decade and a half of taking up root in the literary world, creepypastas are having their own authorship crisis for the same reason as William Shakespeare: the level of artistry involved in the production. This time, my brethren, disaffected loser millennials are coming for one of the only auteurs produced by creepypastas, Kane Parsons. Hey, Zach Glenn, aka Glenn the Golden, joining you again, beloved ceaseless watchers, for more insight into how creepypastas can have a positive impact on the arts by defending Kane Parsons from allegations of using a ghost director. I'm also going to be going over some of the narrative threads that are significant enough in the Backrooms web series that I think will have a positive effect on your enjoyment of the movie if you've never seen the web series before. If the worlds of literature and amateur horror are what you like listening to, I'd love for you to subscribe. I'm currently working on bringing my followers over from other platforms to YouTube, and every bit helps. So the first thing I want to get into about what's happening to Parsons is that it's not unique to him, even historically. His younger fans might not be familiar with his history, but directorship controversies are nothing new to the world of horror. And in fact, I would say that horror has one of the more famous authorship controversies for a director. Tobe Hooper, a guy who is now widely considered to be a great director, at least in part because of his initial film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, was in essentially the same situation as Parsons. Hooper was responsible for what is now considered to be a staple of American Gothic horror, and so he was brought on board for the film Poltergeist to direct. Now, Poltergeist's script and its production was handled by Steven Spielberg. So just like with Kane, people assumed that Hooper was not responsible for the movie, that it was actually Steven Spielberg. But just this year, Spielberg has said that he's never considered any of his movies to be a horror movie, even Jaws, and that he's always wanted to do one. Which tells us now, after a long period of time, that Hooper is the director of Poltergeist for all except the most conspiratorial audience. Personally, I think it's as ridiculous to assume that Kane Parsons is not responsible for the Backrooms as it was for people to assume that Hooper is not responsible for Poltergeist. I think the Backrooms web series and the influence that it's had on the modern horror scene in many ways are roughly as influential as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I wouldn't consider it to be nearly as good as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but the influence is clearly there, which should show people that Kane is an auteur. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the idea of an auteur, it just means author in French. I really think the best way to think of it is any creative project where one person's voice is apparent because they controlled many aspects of the final project. That project was brought to you by someone that you would consider to be an auteur. I'll get into the types of auteurs a little bit later when I talk about why a studio like A24 would want to court someone like Parsons. I do have some concerns that these rumors could have been started by the studio itself. A lot of the rumors that you're hearing about modern films that are coming out are started by the studios as a way to create social media buzz. You don't have to create any advertising spend if you can get people to talk about your movie by just making things up. Now, there could be a potential too, and I think this one might even be more likely, that most of the people that are making up this rumor just have sour grapes. They're resentful towards Parsons for getting a director role so young when they haven't had that same kind of success themselves. However, many directors don't direct their first major motion picture until they're in their 40s. So I really don't think that we should consider this to be something that we hold against Parsons. Since I started this undertaking of trying to use the artistry in the Backrooms, the web series, to prove that Kane was also at the helm of the Backrooms, the film, at least one cast member has stepped in to defend Kane. Just like how Spielberg stepped in to defend Hooper, Mark Duplass has said that Kane has had 3 times the output on set as older directors have on other films. But I can't help but feel like I owe an explanation to some of my more conspiracy-minded viewers. I'm someone who believes that serial killers were programmed by the American government, and I'm also here telling you that these authorship conspiracies specifically are bullshit. Why? I'm clearly someone that likes a good conspiracy theory, especially if it's one that you can back up with something that approaches a fact. However, authorship conspiracies are something in particular that I have a problem with. Authorship conspiracies are not trying to seek out a greater truth. Typically, they are trying to rob some of the creators behind our favorite paintings, movies, books, and video games of the credit for their creations. The fact that Parsons is the real authorial voice behind the Backrooms movie is obvious to me from his first short film. Parsons cares about the syntax of the short film, the language that a short film uses, in a way that's unusual for a young artist. You have an artist who was 17 years old, but still knew enough about the form to want to include a title card that fit the aesthetics of his film. This may not seem like much, but at 17 years old, that shows a level of dedication to the craft that's uncommon in young creators. But I don't want to give only a positive impression of his first short film. It's the first short film as a 17-year-old, and there are a lot of hallmarks present of a young auteur in that first film. The first person to fall into the Backrooms in Kane Parsons, the Backrooms, is Kane Parsons. That's right, folks. It's an author self-insert. And yet, unlike in a lot of other creepypastas, it works. One of the aspects of an authorial self-insert that Parsons seems to understand is that there needs to be a reason for you to want to have a person that shares qualities with the author in the story. By wanting to have an amateur filmmaker fall into the Backrooms so that when he falls out of the Backrooms and careens to his death, the videotape can be recovered and presented to an audience, Kane has a valid reason to want to insert himself in the story. So unlike other young creators, he thought, okay, maybe I want myself in this story. Why should I be in this story? And the why is really important if you're trying to produce art. For better or worse, The Backrooms as a short film also has a lot of tells as being the first entry into a web series. Kane introduces the fungal infection that causes the human victims of the Backrooms to turn into the monsters that stalk its unending halls, teases the idea of government or scientist involvement with some of the bulkheads that get shown, and shows one of the monsters that wanders the halls. Yet, despite all the introduction of world building, this still works as a standalone short film. It tells the story of an artist who gets transported into another world and dies trying to document that other world. In my opinion, being able to show an understanding of the form used to make his art, while also understanding the sensibilities of an online audience that enjoys horror media, made him an even easier choice for a studio than someone like Curry Barker, the director of Obsession, who is also facing malicious rumors of using a ghost director. As much as I like Barker's short film that I've seen, The Chair, it's great, you should check it out if you haven't seen it yet, Parsons just has a much better understanding of virality that would make him an easier sell to a studio. So even out of the current directors facing ghost director allegations, I think that the allegations are most ridiculous coming towards Parsons. While the series does show a lot of different sensibilities of a web series showrunner, especially at first, there are various points of strength in the series, even in early parts, that it's not a surprise to me that A24 would want to take a bet on Parsons. This is especially true when you look at the body of work that A24 typically wants to distribute. A24 has cornered the market on attempting to appeal to social media-based movie communities, especially film Twitter. They do this by appealing to one of the areas that has had a massive critical reappraisal in recent years, which is the idea of vulgar auteurism. I told you I'd get into the type of auteurs later. If auteurism is the idea that there's one authorial voice that is responsible for a work of art, then vulgar auteurism is the idea that even if the art were initially made for only commercial reasons, that it's still capable of being culturally valuable art. The idea of vulgar auteurism is a rebuke of the ideas of Rick Rubin, whose quote I gave in the last episode, and who is an obvious CIA asset, about how art is only art if it does not seek to be commercial first. Vulgar auteurism then is the belief that even if art is created entirely to make the auteur money, that it is still capable of being art. Now, in my opinion, there are certainly people that have tried to take the idea of a vulgar auteur too far. If you look up the Wikipedia definition, it will tell you that two important artists for the movement are Michael Bay and Zack Snyder. And while they both have definitive authorial voices, those voices are widely seen as being shit. I think that an auteur should have to be making good movies. However, there is one artist on that list, and my patron saint of vulgar auteurism, who Parsons' work resembles. The great, but not late, John Carpenter. John Carpenter is most famous as the director of the Halloween movie, but for people who appreciate him as an artist, he stands out because he often composed the soundtracks for his own movies, including Halloween. While Parsons does not name Carpenter as an inspiration in any of his interviews, Halloween is such an influential movie, and the credit that Carpenter gets for both directing and composing is so well known that it would be impossible for me to consider that Parsons is entirely unfamiliar with Carpenter's work. There are actually 2 entries in the series that I believe to be most inspired by some of Carpenter's sound design done for movies like Halloween. The first short that I noticed it in was Backrooms' Autopsy Report, where the musical swells are used to set a tense mood throughout the short, despite the fact that we're watching scenes as an audience that are A, not in the back rooms, and B, feature no real threat to the characters. However, the implied body horror from the fact that the monsters in the back rooms could be what happens to the people who die in the back rooms, and the score are more than enough to make this 3-minute short one of the highlights of the early parts of the series. Roll that beautiful bean footage.
The cause of death was likely malnutrition. I was able to recover most of the digestive tract. So, as things start to deviate from what we would consider to be natural, the decomposition process appears to have been stunted somehow. It's like portions of the body stopped decaying and were sustained.
Likewise, there's another episode that also really shows the advantage of being a director/composer, and that is Backrooms found footage number 3. Really the kind of unofficial finale to the series. In the early parts of the Backrooms web series, we are shown as an audience that the creatures that exist in the backrooms are capable of creating noises. These noises seem like they can be anything ranging from human speech to repetitive melodic phrases. Parsons uses the noise aspect of his creature design incredibly effectively, giving us the sense that the point of view character is being stalked, even when there is nothing on screen other than the unsettling backrooms itself. This is best exemplified at the end of this video when the point of view character of found footage number 3 has completely given up. He finally was able to talk to another human being, and in doing so likely caused that person to also fall in the backrooms. Having completely given up, the man recounts a fight with his girlfriend and talks about missing his friends, girlfriend, and the sun. The whole time, the same melodic, repetitive notes are getting louder as the creature closes in on its quarry.
It's been a while. It's been a little while.
One of the more common criticisms of the movie that I'm seeing is that the movie is scant on plot, or that the movie is more focused on theme and atmosphere than it is on storytelling. While I haven't seen the movie yet, and therefore can't really respond to the criticism of the film, I can contextualize the criticism within the web series and talk about differing approaches to filmmaking without having seen the movie, and perhaps offer a defense of the movie on the return of my movie podcast with my good friend from Penn State Mont Alto's film program, Dean Redacted. Let's hear it for Dean, folks. The idea that a narrative is an essential piece of all Western art is an idea that has been in contention since at least the 1800s, if not longer. There's a great piece by Samuel Shaw for the Tate Gallery that talks about how the idea that paintings should have a story to tell their audience has been hotly debated for some time. While some people prefer pieces like the internet famous piece, The Irritating Gentleman, that tells the story of a man bothering a woman on a train as the woman reaches for a hat pin with tears in her eyes, not all paintings can be said to tell such an obvious story. However, I'm going to go even further than Shaw does in his piece. Would it be possible to say that a Rothko painting has a narrative to tell? I would say no. Most people that are capable of recognizing that Rothko is a good artist also know that a painting can be designed entirely to evoke a mood, showcase the skill and expression in a brushstroke, or evoke a theme in abstract instead of overtly. My big bone to pick with a lot of critics, especially critics that are looking to evoke the popular consensus on a film, is that they don't apply these same ideas to movies. I feel that many of these critics would give a negative review of Buñuel's Unshian Andalou simply because it lacks an overt plot and spends most of its time on abstract images that hint towards a plot and themes. I'm not saying that Parsons' work is already on the same level of quality as these masters of the absurd, but what I am saying is that modern audiences seem like they've totally lost any appreciation for abstraction over convention. In my opinion, in defending Kane, I noticed that the thirst for conventional storytelling in horror is most exemplified by the mixed reactions to Skinamarink. While Skinamarink was a strong entry in the horror genre to me, it also got overlooked as a story that values atmosphere and theme over an actual narrative. While I don't think it's the best recent story that has a very limited narrative, in my opinion, this would be The Lighthouse, which is still a thriller, if not an outright horror movie, and replaces narrative primarily with intrigue. I do think that this will be a movie that Parsons' Backroom most resembles, in that, like Skinamarink, it will be a flawed but highly resonant and thematic text. Unlike a Rothko painting, none of this is to say that the Backrooms doesn't have a plot at all. The Backrooms is primarily about the activities of a company called Async, which discovers the Backrooms in a series of tests involving energy devices that form gateways. The events of the story mostly follow a point of view character working within Async's deployment missions into the Backrooms named Marvin. There's also another named character who's important, who goes on the expedition, who is really the primary driver of the narrative, named Peter. Peter goes on an expedition during which a phenomenon causes him to jump forward 2 months in time. By the time that he's discovered, Peter has been declared dead, and he's kept captive by Async. Eventually, he escapes in a way that alerts everyone of the cover-up, is likely killed for real this time, although it's somewhat ambiguous. And as such, Async is forced to tell its employees that it's been covering up the dangers of the backroom. These dangers likely remove many of the potential vectors for profit that Async was seeking when experimenting with opening up the backrooms in the first place. Despite a good deal of plotting and narrative, almost all of these major plot reveals, with a few exceptions, happen outside of the found footage episodes, which are tense and reveal some of the rules for how the backroom works, but do not follow the events of Async as closely as other parts of the series. Each found footage entry follows a different point of view character, aside from Marvin, who has accidentally found their way into the backrooms while recording something that they were doing. I think it's very fair to say that the backrooms is light on plot. About half of the runtime of the web series is about elements that don't really affect the plot. However, I've seen complaints that the movie is absent of a plot, and I just think this is highly unlikely given that the audience for a web series usually demands less of a plot than the audience for a movie. The last aspect of the scant plot that does exist for the web series that I want to explore is, does what plot that exists exist in service of helping the story develop its themes? And the answer to this, I believe, is a resounding yes. The theme that corporate greed is such a deep hunger that it does not care if its actions cause people to live or die is directly expressed through the graph in the episode Missing Persons, which shows a graph with a sharp increase in missing persons cases after Async began testing their gateway technology. Likewise, there is a theme present throughout the series that curiosity toward the unexplained is an inherently dangerous human emotion. Each of the found footage episodes begins with a person trying to investigate something they don't understand, only to find themselves inside the backrooms fighting for their lives. Unlike the narrative of the story, the themes of the story are developed in both found footage episodes and async-heavy episodes. Peter investigating a mysterious noise is what causes him to wander away from the group and be transported 2 months into the future, held captive by Async, and later killed. This alone makes me very hopeful for the Backrooms because at the same time that it is developing atmosphere, it is also developing theme, which I think is an important part of a film feeling like it has structure and depth. There's also good reason for me to believe that Parsons would have been more than capable of learning quickly under the mentorship of more established directors. There's a lot of care placed in the artistic growth over the course of the runtime of the Backrooms YouTube series that make me think that Parsons would be easy to teach. For example, early on in the series, quite literally the first video listed after the short film, uses a Microsoft Sam-style voice that is common in a lot of analog horror that the Backrooms was competing with for viewer attention. I understand why this choice might have been made creatively, but it's the exact same complaint I had about Abandoned by Disney, where artists with great potential allow the expectations of their audience to run the show. However, one big difference between Abandoned by Disney and the Backrooms is that Parsons learns the lesson very quickly. These videos shown in the series that are supposedly produced by Async, the company that is running the Backrooms experiments, wouldn't be using a Microsoft Sam-ass voice that makes the videos scarier for the employees that are supposed to be watching them. Roll clip. That's it for my look at just some of the artistry that went into the Backrooms web series. If you enjoyed getting a more critical look at the Backrooms instead of just commentary on its Easter eggs and a summary of its narrative, I'd love for you to subscribe. I'm looking at doing this for a few other online web series, but I'd love some suggestions on which series have the same level of care put into them as Parsons' Backrooms. As for me and the Backrooms, I will be seated, and I know whose movie I'm watching. See ya.